Times reporting just this morning that 1 in 5 Americans view terrorism as the #1 issue facing the country. That concern is mirrored in France, where in the regional elections over the past week, the National Front Party jumped to the leadership position among all major parties, going into next weekend's runoff election for regional leadership positions. That is a first in France. A recent poll said that nearly a third of French voters in the age 18 to 30 have voted for the National Front. So these kinds of concerns are paramount to both countries, and we're very pleased to have your panel here today. As many of you are aware, the French-American Foundation was founded in 1976 in New York and in Paris, with the primary mission of enriching a transatlantic relationship between the two countries. It does this by bringing together leaders, policymakers, and a wide range of professionals to discuss areas of mutual concern for our country's mutual benefit. Our objective this afternoon is to contribute to the ongoing discussion in a constructive manner following the horrifying events of the last several weeks in our country and in France, to move to an understanding of the evolving risk these events present, and to discuss potential solutions. Please note that this discussion will be on the record. By way of introduction, my name is Paul Bird. I'm a board member of the French-American Foundation and a partner here at W, and we're pleased to host this event. Our panelists today are a very distinguished group. Ray Kelly, former New York City Police Commissioner, currently Vice Chairman of K2 Intelligence, which is a global security and risk management firm with more than 50 years in public service and decades of experience setting strategies to combat risks faced by nations around the world. Commissioner Kelly is well positioned to offer his insights into what these recent attacks mean for citizens in the U.S. and in France. His experience crosses many borders, and I would like to note that for his services to France as well, Commissioner Kelly has been awarded France's highest decoration, which is the Légion d'honneur, and he's supporting the movement here today to support that. My partner, Judge Mukasey, the 81st Attorney General of the United States, serving under President Bush from 2007 to 2009 as a federal judge in the Southern District of New York. Prior to becoming Attorney General, Judge Mukasey presided over the conspiracy cases arising out of the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, as well as a number of matters later on, including attempts to bomb infrastructure in New York City, the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, the FBI headquarters, and the United Nations building. Judge Mukasey brings firsthand knowledge of the manner in which terrorist plots are planned, sometimes carried out, more often foiled by our security services. Fellow French-American board member Adam Gopnik will moderate our panel today. Adam has been writing for the New Yorker magazine since 1986 and has spent several years living in France during the 1990s. During that time writing a Paris journal for the magazine that many of us look forward to reading. He's a frequent commentator on the relations between the U.S. and France, drawing humorous and thoughtful distinctions between how ordinary citizens live their lives in our two countries. And just to my right, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Judith Miller, who won that distinguished award for her January 2001 series on Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Ms. Miller is currently an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a frequent commentator on Fox News, as she was this morning, speaking on terrorism and other national security issues. Her book, Germs, Biological Weapons in America's Secret War, topped the bestseller list in the wake of 9/11. And to her right, Professor Martin Shane, Professor of Politics at New York University. To our far right, Professor Shane is, no pun intended.
Well to her left and yet somehow to her far right.
That'll come on the panel. Professor Shane is the founder of the Center for European Studies at NYU. He's written several comparative studies analyzing French politics and immigration policies, and he's currently working on a study of the politics of borders in Europe and the United States. So we're very pleased that you could all join us today, and I'll turn it over to Adam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for coming today. I've been asked to lead off this conversation, I think on the seasonal principle that the last shall be first. I am certainly the least expert of all august people who sit on this panel about many of the specifics of questions of terrorism, security, and international relations. But let me, if I may, try and put a bit of a bracket around the conversation and lead it off with a somewhat cosmic historical question. In struggling to understand a moment like this in history, one is always torn between the pull of the particulars and the grasp of the general. On the night of November 13th, I was following the news on France 24 and elsewhere, and my 20-year-old son Luke, who grew up largely in Paris, or in large part in Paris, explained to me that the Eagles of death metal were not, as they were being described on American news, a death metal band at all, but that their name was a sardonic joke about commercialization of death metal, that in fact they were a wonderful and resourceful pop band. Luke, I should explain, he's a musician himself. And then he's paused for a second, he turned to me and said, "Dad, you know, if we had been in Paris tonight, I certainly would have been at that concert." Nothing could bring home to you the actuality of what terrorism means and what it implies more than your son saying that to you. At the same time, we struggle to keep our minds wrapped around a larger historical perspective about what terrorism is, where it comes from, how it persists, and what it means. Martin Shane and I were talking just before we sat down today about the long extent of terrorism in the 20th and 21st centuries, about how at the end of the 19th and 100 years ago, beginning of the 20th century, terrorist groups had successfully assassinated an American president, a French president, and the Tsar of the Russias. I'm wondering about what our response would be if something similar happened today. Different kinds of terrorism, different kinds of challenges. And we also need to discuss, as Paul was saying, one of the immediate knockoff effects of the latest round of terrorist assaults, and that is the rise of the extreme right, both in France and obviously here in the United States as well. The cosmic question I want to put to the panel to start off, and I recognize that it is a large one, as large a question as you can ask, is what distinguishes this moment and this terrorist threat from the ones that we have dealt with throughout the past 100 years? Do we risk overreacting by making it discontinuous from those other threats? Or do we risk underreacting by pretending that it is containable, as so many of those earlier threats were? And above all, what I think is the central question, is the right response essentially military or essentially political? And when I say political, I don't mean simply acts of placation, but I mean broad use of police powers, persuasion, all of the ways that we have traditionally tried to cope with terrorist threats that don't involve invasions and infantry and sending the military abroad. I've seen just in the past few weeks an extraordinary pivot in the minds and hearts of so many of my friends in France, people who would, including large parts of the Socialist Party, who would have been extremely skeptical of a military solution to a terrorist threat, have swung around quite decisively in the last few weeks to feel, as my friend Pascal Bruckner, the philosopher, said, we are at war, and war must be conducted as wars are fought. Pascal, not in any sense normally a militaristic guy. Is that the right approach, or is it an overreaction to a deliberate provocation which only serves the purposes of the provocateurs more successfully? Both is the easy and obvious answer, both political and military solutions, both political military threats. That's the obvious and easy answer, but I don't intend to let the panel off with the obvious and easy question, because which of those two routes we take changes the resources we draw on, the emphasis we place, the role we choose to play in the world, and indeed the life of our kids as they attend rock concerts and plan their future. So if I may, let me start with that question. Political or military? Martin, can I turn to you?
Sure. I'm glad you gave me an easy question. I'm thinking for a moment where to begin, but I think probably the place to begin is in 1995, 1996. I believe it was 1995, it may have been 1996, when a young French citizen, an Algerian guy, who had grown up in France, I think he'd been born in Algeria, planted a bomb under the tracks of a fast train between Paris and Lyon to TGV. That bomb never went off. It was discovered. And by chance, this young man was someone that a colleague of mine in France had interviewed as part of his doctoral dissertation. The result was a 2-page spread in Le Monde about something that we are now very much aware of, and that is that France, in some sense, is not a war at its borders, so that it's not an international war, but in some sense is at war with itself. It's at war with a deuxième génération, that is a second, what's usually referred to as a second generation, a generation of mostly young men, but some young women as well, who were raised in France, and indeed in Europe, because they are very much Europeans, who cross European borders easily, who have hit what colleagues of mine who have been studying with these things refer to as the glass ceiling. That is, this is a young generation that does not, in some ways, see its future in France. Is this typical of the deuxième génération? The answer is no, not really. But it's certainly typical of a subset of the second generation. And therefore, now I can get to your question. The question is the solution military, or is it really a police matter? Is it a criminal matter? Well, it's hard to deal in a military way if you're dealing with large numbers of your own citizens in Europe. And it's something that Europeans have been reluctant to come to grips with. And indeed, those of us who are familiar with Europe know this very well, and that is Europe is not now what it was 2 generations ago. It's a Europe that really is quite different. And so this is not a generation that could be dealt with by sending, by military action, for example, in Iraq. And therefore, it seems to me, to the extent to which they are inspired by, even organized by ISIS, yes, there are things to be done. But in fact, this is something that has to be dealt with internally in Europe.
Thank you, Martin. Commissioner Kelly, can I turn to you? Your expertise, as we all know, is very much on the specifics of.
Well, yeah, I certainly would not say, have to pick one or the other, that the military will address this issue. You have to accept the notion immediately that radical Islamic beliefs are a movement. It's not an army. Yes, there is a land force in the Middle East, but obviously the movement, particularly for us in this country, is much more relevant and more significant. And it's also a guerrilla entity as well. So let's say ISIS, for instance, though we know Al-Qaeda is certainly out there and certainly active, but it is, yes, a ground military force. It is a movement, and it's a guerrilla operation that, in fact, if we did go in militarily, we'd see that guerrilla force in action. I don't think.
Excuse me, the guerrilla force in Europe and the United States more actively.
Yes,
than, right.
yeah. I don't believe that U.S. troops in any significant number should be on the ground. I do think that we should have some skin in the game by increasing the number of special operations capacity troops by a significant number. It is something that we're going to be fighting for a long time to come. If we moved in militarily, I don't think we'd win. Let's put it that way. And I think it would strengthen in many ways the movement, the inspirational reach of ISIS And Al-Qaeda, of course, we see Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra in Syria as well.
I want obviously to ask the rest of the panel about this first question, but since we have you here, can I ask you just quickly, Commissioner Kelly, one of the things that's been remarkable in New York in the years since 9/11 is the absence of follow-up, the absence
Yeah.
which very few people would have credited in the weeks immediately after 9/11, as I'm sure you'd recall. Does that speak at all, do you think, to what Professor Shane was talking about in terms of a radicalized second generation that doesn't exist in the United States to the same degree, that our politics of assimilation have been more successful?
I think it's difficult to say. Clearly, we have a different universe of people in this country. The Muslim community is middle class for the most part in this country. They're educated. That's not the case in Europe. We know that jobs are hard to find, that sort of thing. So there's probably much more fertile ground to work on for the recruiters who do a surprisingly effective job. If you look at these recruitment videos, they're very sophisticated, very well done. Almost all of them have the picture of the World Trade Center burning. I'm very proud of that. The basic message is your religion is under attack. You have an obligation to try to level the playing field, and they'll show pictures of atrocities, real or imagined abuses on the part of U.S. troops in particular. So to answer your question, I think we have to go far beyond a military approach to this because I don't see it working. And as a result, or not as a result, but I also see this fight going on for many, many decades.
Thank you. Judge Mukasey?
Okay, I think I may wind up being the naysayer of the group.
Please.
First of all, I think it's dangerous to draw parallels across terrorist lines and to speak of terrorism that resulted in the assassination of the Tsar, and terrorism that resulted in the assassination of the president, and so on and so forth. This is a particular kind of terrorism. It is Islamist terrorism, and it is motivated in a particular way. I also realize that historical parallels are very dangerous, but there have been eruptions of Islamist revivalism in the past. Perhaps the most recent parallel was one that occurred in the 19th century.
Cartoon.
Yes, well, the cartoon. And the British thought that they could sort of let it slide and not get involved, and they lost the general, and they lost the emperor of Ethiopia, and finally realized that they would have to go in. And Kitchener went in at the Battle of Omdurman and routed the then Mahdi movement and destroyed them on the ground, along with
We've got a very good movie out of it, too.
yeah, and along with a young cavalryman named Winston Churchill, and that force of arms put an end to it. Force of arms has put an end to it elsewhere in the Arabian Peninsula as well. And my own belief is that, particularly given the current caliph's position, that he deserves to be the caliph because of he holds the golden coin, which is victory. That the only way to stop that, the only way to destroy it, is to destroy it on the ground where it is. He has sort of, it's in a way, it's kind of a bit of marketing genius. Build it and it's field of dreams. Build it and they will come. He has built it and they're coming. In a way, I think there are two motivations behind this doctrine. One is the doctrine itself, i.e. certain elements within Islam, and we can talk about that if you want, because it's both a spiritual and a political religion. To the extent that it's spiritual, that's fine. To the extent that it's political, maybe it ain't so fine. But there is that motivation, but then there's also the other motivation, which is success. There's nothing that attracts supporters like success. And so far, he has been able to boast of success, both where he is, and in Paris, and in California, hopefully not too many other places. I think the reason that he's not been able to boast of success in New York has to do with Ray Kelly and his force, which is, I will tell you, absolutely unparalleled any place in the United States. Absolutely unparalleled.
And have an international presence as well.
And has an international presence as well. They are in every city, in every location where there's been a terrorist attack, and they learn from it. They were in Mumbai, they were in Paris, they were in London, they were all over. They have been all over. It's not simply to pay their respects. They know how to fight this. What it takes is political will, and I'm not certain that we have the political will to do it, but I think that's what it's going to take.
Just to sharpen lines, just to be clear about what we're arguing over, the case you're making is that if one eliminates that success, and if one eliminates the caliphate, then the appeal to second generation or whatever group, whatever potentially vulnerable group is, will be so drastically reduced as to make it much less of a threat, of a problem.
Understand,
Is that fair?
that's fair. I understand I'm not ruling out a political element here, but I think that it is distinctly secondary.
Okay, thank you. Judy?
I'm actually going to agree with Judge Mukasey, having worked in the Middle East for so long and having watched Egypt and other Arab countries struggle with a tendency and a trend which is as old as Islam itself. Now, the only thing that's really different is their ability to get out their message through the internet and also the degree of destruction they can reap through modern weapons and weapons we haven't yet seen, but they are thinking very much about and have thought about since the beginning of their movement, and that is WMD. I agree with Judge Mukasey because I think not only culturally, we have to put ourselves inside of their heads, but just listen to Osama bin Laden, who said Arabs, Muslims will always follow the strong horse. And part of what attracts young people to this movement is the notion that they're winning, that they occupied a state the size of Indiana in virtually 6 months. They were not stopped. They were told that if they come over there, they can have women. They don't have to marry them. They can shoot people up. They're not playing video games. They're playing real live games, and they're doing it in the name of their religion. They're doing good. This is a winning message. We can't counter this message unless they begin to lose big time. And that's why Zarqawi, called the original founder of ISIS, called the Iraq invasion the blessed invasion, because he saw huge amounts of soldiers coming over to take back territory. The goal was right, the strategy was right, the tactic was wrong. You do it, I agree with the gentleman on this panel, through special forces, through a reduced presence, and by mobilizing Muslim communities themselves. And if I want to talk about the importance of taking back sanctuary, this is not a new idea. This comes to us from the 9/11 Commission after our last disaster here, which said you must deprive these groups of the ability to organize, mobilize, and train thousands of people in their own country and who come to them. We have still not absorbed that message. We are still letting sanctuaries proliferate now in 9 countries. So the only way to stop this movement ideologically is to deny them through military means what they seek. That is, portray them as losers, and you will rapidly diminish their appeal to the younger generation. Finally, I would only say this. You need to mobilize Muslim leaders across the world. When Abdel Fattah el-Sisi stood up in front of his own clerics, his own scholars, Muslim scholars, and said, Islam, our religion, has been hijacked by these people, and we need a reformation, we need a revolution in our religion. He received polite applause in Washington, but the President of the United States did not find time to meet with him and saying thank you for that call when Sisi made his first trip to the United States to address the United Nations. You cannot win without an ideological political struggle, but most of all, you need Muslim allies because it's their fight, they're the victims, but we can help, and we haven't been doing enough. Thank you.
Well, I find that those to my right are to my left, and those to my left are to my right, which is probably appropriate. Martin, would you care to respond to it?
No, I just have a question. The question is to the folks on the other side of you. What both of you seem to be defying is a really vast mobilization of American and European forces. I mean, if we talk about boots on the ground, I think we understand we're talking about something more than special forces, right?
No, I would do it. I would start with special forces. I think these people are not 10 feet tall. There are 30,000 of them. We can do this. I watched it done in Iraq.
But the question that we were asked to talk about today is not whether we can defeat ISIL on the ground in Syria and Iraq, but whether we can prevent the kinds of attacks that have taken place in Europe and in the United States from taking place again. And your answer to this seems to be, yes, we can, if we deprive them of sanctuary, that is, if we deprive them
And legitimacy.
of their territorial sanctuary and legitimacy. But it seems to me that that these attacks very much predate, in numerous ways, the kind of sanctuary and legitimacy of territory that you're talking about. That is, the legitimacy of territory that you're talking about actually postdate many of the attacks that have taken place. And what you're saying is that the core of the problem is the legitimacy of the territory that's now being occupied by the so-called caliphate. Eliminate that, and we can eliminate the problem that we're experiencing here in Europe and the United States. I must say, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
No, I'm saying you can't do the latter. You can't fight the ideological war without denying them the territory that they're using to arm, train, and mount attacks against us. That's a prerequisite. That's only the beginning. This is, I agree with everyone else, a generational struggle. But you can't do it as long as they can organize and say to the world, we're winning and no one can stop us. It's human nature. It's not Islamic. It's being a human being. Join the winning side.
Yeah, I think if we're going to have a credible military effort there, it has to be led or made up almost totally by Sunni countries. In many quarters, ISIS is seen as defenders of Sunni. They're
From
anti-Shia,
persecution.
from the Muslim world, from countries such as people in Egypt and Turkey, which, by the way, if you add Saudi Arabia, there's about 1.2 million troops that are under arms in those three countries. So unless they see
I'm
themselves...
sorry, in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and
500,000 in Egypt,
Mhm.
500,000 in Turkey, 250,000 in Saudi Arabia. That is potentially a very formidable military force. We see no inclination on their part to come together. As a matter of fact, the air attacks, the coalition of countries that decided to bomb after certain atrocities, Jordan, the UAE, that's all fallen by the wayside. We're doing all the bombing. Of course, the Russians are now an added factor. So I think putting together a credible military force, absent U.S. using significant conventional troops, is just a non-starter. It's not going to happen. There's no indication that it's going to go forward. So, and I also think if we were involved, it's no guarantee that we have victory. That's why I talked about the guerrilla movement and how do you separate people. I mean, these are not stupid people we're dealing with. There's a lot of commingling going on. For instance, in the city of Rafah, we know that's their strategy. How do you separate the people? So I don't see it as realistic. I understand, I have a military background myself, but it's much more nuanced and more complicated.
Judge Mukasey, did you have something to respond to that?
Yeah, I thought there are plans around. Jack Keane, who's retired four-star, now head of an organization called the Institute for the Study of War, cheerful name, valuable institution, has said that with 50,000 special forces, making in and out raids, knowing where they're going and what they're doing, we could put a stop to ISIS on the ground pretty fast. But that's a lot, that's a big number. But understand that that is only part of the struggle. The rest of it has to do with the appeal of the message insofar as it comes from the religion. And as I said before, the religion is in part spiritual, it is in part political. And to the extent that it's political, it is in relevant ways inconsistent with a secular society and with being governed by a secular society. And that's something we're going to have to face up to and focus on. I mean, there's a political candidate who will not be unnamed, but at least whose name will not be mentioned, at least not by me, who suggests that we should ban Muslims from coming to the United States. What he's not focusing on is that the problem is not Muslims, it is the tendency of some Muslims to live in insular lives as they do in France and as they do outside Minneapolis, Minnesota, which has been a recruiting ground for foreign fighters to go overseas. And that is the point. The point is, are you a Muslim, but do you adhere to Sharia? Do you separate yourself from the rest of society? Do you believe that it is your duty to prevail ultimately, and for your religion to prevail ultimately? And that's a tough nut to crack, but that's where the focus has to be. And I think that when we
Excuse me, when you say that's where the focus has to be, specifically, how would one go about altering that?
altering it where?
In the United States?
Get the message out through Muslims. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser was the head of an organization called the American Institute for Democracy. I'm sorry, the American Islamic Institute for Democracy, AIF, is an excellent messenger. He's not welcome at the White House. CARE, the Conference of American Islamic Relations, which was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the biggest terrorist financing case in the United States, is welcome at the White House. There's something very cognitive about that.
Can I just say
Sure,
something
please.
about the largest Arab force, which is the Egyptians? I've been in Egypt twice in the past 6 weeks. Once after the dreadful bombing of the Russian plane in which 229 largely Russian citizens were blown up with something the size of a Coke can, basically. It was a explosive put in a Coke can. It would have been very hard for even the best intelligence service or Department of Homeland Security to have stopped that explosion. But Egypt is fighting at the moment for its very life. They are very busy. They don't have the forces to send to Syria because they are fighting on their 1,000-mile Libyan border where ISIS is already moving to protect themselves in case the Americans and allies move against Raqqa, the current capital. They've already moved into Syria, into Sirte, where Gaddafi ruled the country, an extra irony. But they are trying to prevent the infiltration of men and equipment across their border, and they're fighting a really vicious, ugly war in the Sinai. And they are losing, according to the French and the American defense people whom I spoke with. They are besieged. They have roughly 40,000 people, the estimate now is, in prisons that are not even marked to try and suppress the uprising. They're very busy. I think there is a limit to what we can expect of these people, but at least they're fighting because Egypt is at stake. Egypt also, by the way, I just remind you, has the largest Christian population in an Arab country. It's 10% of 90 million people. So there's a lot at stake.
Judge Mukasey, you had something to add?
Yeah, just to add a small point to what Judy was saying just a minute ago. President Sisi, last year, I think, at Christmas time, visited the largest Coptic church in Cairo, which is unheard of for the head of a Muslim state, to wish them a Merry Christmas and to indicate support for the Christian community, the besieged Christian community in Egypt. Not only that, but the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, which is the seat of Sunni learning in the Sunni world. I mean, he is the the chief rabbi of the Sunnis, if you will, has gotten up in front of an audience of his own clerics after Sisi spoke and said that we have been misleading our young people. We have been ruining generations of young people. We have got to stop. We've got to stop being a source of death. He then took that message to Saudi Arabia. I would not want to write a life insurance policy on this guy. You have not heard a word about that in the United States, nor has the United States provided support for getting that message out. And that is a huge mistake, because that is a way of getting it out authoritatively. Yes, he's supported by the Sisi government, okay? So some people will claim, well, he's a bought and paid for cleric. That's fine. He is the head of the Sunni seat of learning. And in that respect, he carries a lot of weight. His message should be made to carry a lot of weight, and we should do whatever we can to help it.
Martin?
I just want to say a few words about just an offhand, a footnote actually, and that is the question of Muslim insularity, particularly Muslim insularity in France. A couple of things. The first is that I think that this is a bad description of exactly what's happening in the so-called Muslim community in France. It's a little too simplistic. There are roughly 5 million Muslims in France, most of whom never enter a mosque.
Olivia was, this is the Muslim population, not...
Population, yeah. But we have a lot of difficulty defining these things. By and large, what we're talking about is people whose families come from Muslim countries. And whatever that means, it's really, really hard to say. But the attacks in Paris on November 13th were very striking to me. It was in an area that I know well, I've been there many, many times. It's actually an area in which there are many, many Muslims, so to speak, that is, people who come from Muslim countries, in which there is an intermingling of people who come from the immigration and native French population that is really very, very striking. One of the, as many of you know, one of the cafes that was attacked, the manager was Jewish, his wife was Muslim, and so on and so forth. But it is an area in which there is a great deal of multiculturalism. In the Seine-Saint-Denis, where which was also attacked, the Seine-Saint-Denis has changed a great deal, an enormous amount since I first went there in the 1970s and 80s. It was then largely, or very, very much, a population of people who had come from North Africa. The first thing that hits you when you get out of the metro stop at Seine-Saint-Denis is that there are a lot of Sikhs around.